Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to talk about the state regiments of the Empire. A topic that finally lets me channel some of my pike and shot knowledge. I swear to God. The pike and shot era is one of the coolest, most interesting eras in military history, and yet no one ever covers it, no one ever talks about it, and certainly nobody makes games set in the era. Even Warhammer Fantasy that takes more than one page out of the Holy Roman Empire playbook barely ever even acknowledges its inspiration. That's enough bellyaching, I do suppose. So, the Empire's state troops. One of the most immediately relevant and interesting pieces of information relating to the state troops is that the Empire's military isn't really a military at all, but rather 14 separate militaries that all operate in more or less a similar fashion, as each one of the elector countships have their own standing army of state's troops, equip them depending upon their own local standards, and they are uniformed again in accordance with local standards and traditions. Indeed, we could even actually go even more granular than that, with cities, townships, regions, provinces, or even indeed individual commands having their own distinct appearances. But before we get completely lost in the weeds of detail already, let's return to the basis of what state troopers are. So, as mentioned, each one of the electoral provinces within the Empire is required by order of Karl Franz, the Emperor himself, to maintain standing armies. This tradition is nothing new to the Empire. In fact, it stems all the way back to the time of Sigmar himself, when he united all of the varied tribes of what is today the Empire into one large confederation of nations. And that is very much so what the Empire remains today, a confederation of largely independent nations. Of course, they are all subservient to the Emperor, and they tend to have a more or less unified foreign policy, but in local matters, Hochland bows to Wiesenland, no more than Wiesenland bows to Averland, and etc., etc., etc. In fact, the various elector countships have even been at war with one another on more than a few occasions, even sometimes splitting the entire empire into massive civil wars, like the time of 3 emperors, for example. And during such tumultuous times, it's very handy to have a locally raised standing army, whose loyalty the elector count can rely upon entirely. This is obviously a way for the various elector countships to retain their independence, as the strength of any nation militarily has always been inexorably linked to its military might and ability to both maintain its independence and enforce its will upon other neighboring nations. But for the most part, the Empire is a relatively cooperative entity, where the state troops are expected to not attack other state troopers, but rather serve at the will of the Emperor when it comes to international matters, and of course in the defense of the province against external forces. But how exactly this is done is again left entirely up to the various elector countships, though there are some fairly significant similarities. For example, how is a state regiment raised? Well, you need a lot of dudes to fill its ranks. That is the first and most obvious step of all, and it begins by issuing a commission to raise a regiment. This commission can be given to essentially anyone that the elector count or local lord or local mayor, etc. deem worthy of it. It could be an experienced captain from the state militia. It could be a mercenary captain. It could be a local lord or dignitary, or even simply just a prominent individual. Commissions are obviously handed out whenever the state requires more troops, but it can also be handed out as a form of reward, as being given command of a regiment is not only a tremendous honor, obviously, but also comes with significant financial benefits as well. Once the commission has been issued, then the men need raising. Usually, the officer is issued with the various resources he requires already at this early point. Sometimes this can include access to the armories, so that weapons and armor is prepared for the regiment before it is even raised, and on other occasions, the officer in question is simply issued with enough money to cover any potential costs, including uniforming and arming the regiment, but we'll return to that in a little moment. First, the actual men. The most common procedure for recruiting state troopers is, quite simply, to organize a nice-looking colours band, maybe a few strapping young lads in armour and uniform, and then marching straight into the local city or town square and begin beating the drums. This is where the term drumming up comes from, incidentally, as this was a practice oft used in our world as well. When people hear the beating of the drums, they know that a recruitment group is in town. Every young, virile man, of course, is going to be interested in a life as a professional soldier, and the recruiters will do their damnedest to pretty up the reality of things, promising them adventure, wealth, advancement through the rank. Maybe there's a general's baton in your future, son. More likely it's a piece of steel in your spine, but details. Of course, perhaps the most alluring promise of all, 3 square meals a day with pay. Now that might not sound like much to us, but to a barely post-feudal world peasant who can never even be sure that he's going to be eating tomorrow at all, that's a pretty sweet deal. Particularly when you take into consideration that 98% of the time he will be asked to do basically nothing at all. Since state troopers, the overwhelming majority of the time, aren't actually fighting anything. Large-scale wars are relatively uncommon. More often than not, they might be set to chase off bandits here and there, skirmish with some light groups of greenskins on the frontiers, maybe if it's one of the border provinces. But the rest of the time, it's drill, guard duty, occasionally some light police work, and some state troopers also double as fire watchmen for cities and towns. Compared to spending every hour of every day doing back-breaking labor in the fields, it ain't too bad. Now, of course, during the other small percentage of the time, you are going to be facing down a screaming orc trying to chop your arms off, or a chaos warrior twice your size attempting to butt-fuck you to death with a halberd, but again, the odds of this happening are relatively small. So I suppose what I'm really asking is, do you feel lucky, punk? And as it turns out, a lot of young men feel remarkably lucky, and are more than happy to join up with the state trooper regiments. And indeed, in many cases, young men will join up explicitly because they're hoping to get into some action, with that youthful determination to go and get bloodied somewhere. And in the cases of some regiments, this might be the explicit idea of raising them, or raising reinforcements for the regiment. For example, anyone joining up to the Stir River Patrol pretty much knows what they're getting into, as their entire duty is to patrol up and down the Stir River looking for pirates. You're gonna be getting into some skirmishes if you join their ranks, or one of the more renowned regiments of the Empire, like the Death Jacks, for example. Now, this is a pseudo-elite regiment of Stirland, as it has a hefty reputation, and usually they don't take just anybody. In particular, in the case of experienced archers like these, they might recruit amongst local hunters, or even winners of archery competitions, etc., but the idea remains more or less the same. The second step in the process, once the required number of men have been recruited, a number which can vary significantly, mind you, but is usually a relatively small one, the word regiment here is deeply misleading, as when the Empire raises a regiment, it raises it around a singular weapon specialization, so a regiment of all halberdiers, or all crossbowmen, or all archers, etc. Which, yes, is an absolutely retarded way of doing things, and makes absolutely no logical sense, particularly within a pike and shotty setting like this, but details. I'm probably going to complain more about that in the future, but now that the men have been raised, the next step is to actually outfit them. Now, often, their equipment will come from the state armory, in which case they will be issued with pre-made uniforms, their weapon of choice, and armor. In the case of a halberdier, for example, he is obviously going to be given a halberd. He is probably going to be given a cuirass, a steel helmet, tassels, and possibly a gorget or greaves. This can again vary tremendously, as there is no overall Empire standard on equipment beyond, well, a halberd should be a halberd and a spear should be a spear, I suppose. And the level of equipment that each state trooper receives usually depends on how well stocked the local state armory is. For example, a rich city like Aveland might equip its troops with fine cloth of multiple colours. They might equip them with plated helmets, greaves, tassels, cuirass, shoulder guards, and even decorations like collared plumes. Whereas a poor province like Stirland might not even issue its state troopers with any protection. You could easily see a regiment of spearmen or halberdiers possessing no protection at all, beyond a simple wooden shield, or maybe helmets or a single cuirass, for example. One must also assume, although this is not technically in the law, mind you, but it would make a lot of sense as it did happen in the real world as well, that a lot of these poorer provinces would focus most of its armor protection on the front ranks. This was a common practice in our world as well, hailing all the way back to the age of hoplite warfare, where the front rank of a formation was made up by the best protected men, carrying as much armor as they could. The second rank would carry less, the third rank would carry less than that again, and all the way at the tail end of the regiment, you may have men completely unarmored. It would make a lot of sense for a nation like Stirland to do just that, giving the maximum amount of protection to the front rank, hoping that you won't need to rely on the second and the third and the fourth. Uniform appearances also come into play here as well, as in many cases, nice-looking uniforms are, of course, expensive. Beautiful-looking uniforms like those seen in Reichland, with lots of colour patterns and details and multicoloured individual pieces of clothing, that all takes a long time to make. Some regiments even being given decorated armour with golden trim, etc. Whereas, again, poorer areas like Stirland, you might see state troopers just wearing simply green or peasant trousers, or in the best case scenario, a yellow jacket with green trousers to kind of indicate their colours. In more extreme scenarios, a regiment might not even be issued with uniforms at all, being simply given workman's-like outfits, a tunic, a pair of pants that are virtually indistinguishable from what they might wear as peasants. Now, it's still important that you can actually identify units in the field, obviously, so in these cases they are usually issued with either a hat or a helmet or something simple like that with a coloured plume attached, like green and yellow feathers for Stirland. On other occasions, regiments are raised without any direct access to the armories at all. In some cases, the person being given the commission will be given a sum of money, and it is then up to the commissioned officer to make do, to get whatever weapons is required, whatever armor is required, and whatever uniforms is required. In these cases, the commissioned individual is usually given some sort of requirements, like raise X amount of men, give them all swords and shields, and give them this level of protection. And it is up to the commissioned officer in question to figure out some way of making the money last. In other cases, the commissioned officer themselves might actually raise the regiment on their own. Now, private armies are somewhat frowned upon in the Empire, as they are often confused for bandits for mysterious reasons, but it is not entirely unheard of. Usually this is done via some sort of temporary commission or a commission issued with significant privileges. For example, von Kragsberg's Guard. This is a unit that serves Averheim mostly, of very, very well-equipped and experienced halberdiers. And as the name indicates, they are raised by the von Kragsberg family. Presumably because of some ancient familial grant or something like that. They do, again, technically serve Averland, but they do so on a contractual basis, meaning that the state actually needs to pay them kinda like mercenaries. And they are also free to seek employment wherever else they want. In fact, the von Kragsberg Guard have been known to travel up and down the Empire and even the Dwarf Roads and the Silk Roads on occasion, offering their services to the highest bidder. Again, this is rare, but not unheard of, and if you are asking a noble to raise a regiment entirely at his own expense, you're probably going to have to offer him pretty significant privileges to get him to do so, because it is expensive to raise a force of fighting men. Even more so when you take into consideration that state regiments are raised on a permanent basis. Meaning that you've got to feed, water, clothe, and house them for a very long time. Another reason why the Empire prefers its decentralized military. If you can shift the cost of maintaining an army over onto your subjects, well, that is a lot of money saved. And there are, of course, other advantages with having a standing army. Most obviously that you can keep them to a decent level of drill. This also does vary somewhat, like the formations of Hochland and the Drakwold patrols in particular are usually very, very good, because they have to be kept very, very good to defend against the countless dangers that reside within the Drakwold forest, also giving them plenty opportunity to gain valuable combat experience. Whereas more peaceful provinces might need to keep up a stricter degree of drills to keep their formations properly fit for the fight. And in some cases, this also leads to regiments essentially falling into disarray or states of disrepair. It's expensive to keep men drilling all day, because again, you've got to feed them, you got to clothe them, and you got to house them, and they don't actually produce anything to make up for the investment. Unless you send them raiding your neighbors, I do suppose, I guess. And, of course, the more you drill them, the more they damage their equipment. Clothing tears, boots get worn out, bowstrings get frayed, shafts on halberds break, etc., etc., etc. A formation of fighting men at practice will devour equipment at a frightening rate. Even more so if you're using something complex, like firearms, for example. And things get even more complicated if you want to drill your regiments together. Now, this is why in our own history, we tended to raise regiments out of all of the branches that the army was going to consist of. See the The Dutch model of pike and shot, for example, where the pikemen would operate in close proximity and direct unison with musketeers or flintlock men at the time. This was very useful because the two formations relied on one another for their battlefield prowess, and in theory the armies of the Empire would do much the same. Thus, if you want the most effective army possible, you need to drill your swordsmen alongside the halberdiers whose flanks they are protecting. You need to drill both of these alongside your ranged troops, so that they can get used to bolts and arrows whizzing overhead, and that you can get the ranged troops used to not shooting your spearmen in the back of the head. And this gets even more complicated when you add in other forces. See, the regiments of the Empire are universally of the foot-slugging variant. Spearmen, halberdiers, swordsmen, crossbowmen, bowmen, or men carrying firearms. They do not raise state regiments of cavalry. They do not raise state regiments of artillery or specialists, except for, occasions like the Ster River Patrol or the Drakveld Forests. Instead, things like artillery batteries are usually provided by engineering colleges, and things like cavalry are provided by the noble classes, either acting as pistoliers or some amongst the knightly orders. So if you want to organize your cavalry alongside your state troopers, you've got to get them both to operate at the same time. And that's before we get into even more esoterical and fancy shit like, magic, for example. See, a fireball will scare the shit out of your enemy, but it might also frighten your own dudes when they see a giant fiery comet flying above their heads. And of course, if you want to carry out anything resembling complex maneuvers, like withdrawing cavalry through the ranks of your infantry, for example, you're going to need a lot of practice, which means a lot of wear and a lot of tear and a lot of replacements, and a lot of regiments simply cannot afford it. Thus, the quality of the regiments will also vary greatly. Though there is one exception to this. The best of the state troopers are usually levied into a singular, proper state-standing elite regiment. That is the Greatswords. They usually fulfill the role of elite bodyguards to the elector count, and thus they are usually relatively few in numbers, though many states, and occasionally even cities, maintain their own greatsword regiments as bodyguards to a mayor, for example. On some occasions, there are also greatsword regiments that are maintained out of honourable tradition, like the Karaberg greatswords, for example. And unlike the regular state troopers, the greatswords are usually exempt from the more mundane tasks like fire brigades and policing, and instead busy themselves with training, with combat practice, and becoming the best bodyguards they possibly can be. In the larger and wealthier states and cities, there might also be multiple regiments of greatswords, allowing them to be dispatched to battlefield operations and fighting alongside other state troopers. Or simply, troops within the regiment will be dispatched to fulfill these duties. But the life of a great swordsman is far beyond the vast majority of state troops. So what do the state troops actually do, then? Well, as I mentioned, they usually carry out some ancillary duties and drill. Drill being the most important to keep them fit for the fight, of course. But seeing as having just a bunch of wastrels sit around all day, except when they occasionally march in formation, would be seen as an enormous waste by most provinces, they are usually given the extra duties, policing, town guards, manning the walls, fire duty, and things like these. This is not always the case, however, and it's usually a feature of more sedimentary regiments, city guards, for example, a permanent garrison. Obviously, they might act as a police force because, well, why not? You've got a bunch of armed men that you pay. might as well utilize them to keep order, right? Often this will require a slightly different skill set, and they will learn that as well, in which case they'll simply become part soldier, part policeman. In more unstable provinces, they might be used more actively for combat duties, like, again, the Stir River Patrol or the Drakwold Patrols. In the case of a major rich city like Newlyn, they might also be engaged in drills with other regiments far more frequently, or, even more importantly, alongside the colleges of engineers, learning how to operate in close cooperation with cannons or Hellblaster volley guns or mortars and the myriad of instruments of destruction utilized by that proud city. These state troops are the most traditionally soldierly type around, but there also exists more, almost pseudo-militia formations. A village, for example, that has created a regiment of state troopers will probably not afford to keep them up and running all the time. In these cases, the state troopers will come together once a month, or if they're really zealous, once a week to carry out their drills, but the rest of the time they will be simple peasant farmers, doing whatever it takes to survive. They will usually be paid a pittance here and there to make up for the labor time they lose drilling, but by and large these troops will be expected to take care of themselves, get their own food, their own lodging, and their own clothing. In some cases, I am also sure that they will be regiments that are, poorly treated. It was a very common thing in our own history for people who were granted commissions to raise regiments to think to themselves, I was given X amount of money. If I manage to scrimp and save and cut on costs at every corner, I would have more money for myself. Things like issuing soldiers with bundles of cloth rather than the uniforms and then telling them to make their own uniforms, for example. Or only paying them very rarely, getting away with any and all excuses they can to refuse them payment. Or saying that, you're paying for your own food, or you're paying for your own lodging, etc., etc. And in the Empire, where there is no overarching governmental bureau that is constantly checking up on the regiments to detect such things, I imagine it is a very frequent occurrence in the Empire to have regiments saying things like, there's 300 men in my regiment, whereas in reality maybe there's only half or less, while still drawing pay, of course, for all 300 from the state coffers. And as for that small percentage of the time when the state troopers are asked to fight on the battlefield, well, more often than not, they actually perform very, very well. See, we've talked a lot about how the Empire is often fairly peaceful, and truly, it is. The majority of the time, there aren't any huge wars going on. Orc wargs, or Skaven invasion, or chaos insurrections are relatively uncommon. The usual threats towards the state trooper regiments will come from brigands, bands of beastmen, marauding minor tribes of orcs, goblins maybe, and stuff like that. Not pitched battles against major forces of invading enemies. More often than not in these cases, the regiments themselves will not really fight as organized troops, but rather as individuals on patrol. In these cases, the state troopers perform very well. They are, again, professional soldiers. They're not like militia men or anything, most of the cases anyways. They know each other, they know their combat roles, they are reasonably well equipped, very well equipped in some cases, and with the example of Stirling River patrols and the Drakwold patrols and the more combat-oriented regiments, they are also usually veterans of countless such engagements. The Empire State Troopers are nothing to sneeze at, and if they would only actually cooperate properly with other arms of the military, they'd be truly fearsome. But I suppose I am expecting too much of an empire that's been around for like 2,000 years. Give them another 1 or 2,000 and I'm sure they'll develop some sort of basic combined arms strategy. Then again, looking at the Imperium of Man and its 10,000-year history of stubbornly refusing to do so, even if it has its reasons, to be fair, perhaps I am simply being far, far too optimistic. Still, the Empire State troops remain the solid backbone of the Empire's armies. Whilst the knights may be dashing, whilst the artillery may be thunderous and the specialists like the pistoliers might be far cooler, none of them would be able to operate with anywhere near the same efficiency without solid blocks of spearmen, halberdiers, swordsmen, archers, handgunners, and crossbowmen with which to rely upon. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.